The Philosophy of Desire, a journey through libertinage. Tonight, I want to take you to a place where philosophy meets desire, where intellect dances with passion, and where dangerous ideas bloomed in candlelit rooms across Europe. This is the story of libertinage, a movement that dared to ask forbidden questions about human nature, and change the world in ways we're still discovering today. They called it libertinage, a French word that would make bishops clutch their crosses and send moral guardians into fits of righteous fury. But what was it, really? More than mere hedonism, more than simple rebellion. It was a philosophy that dared to ask, what if pleasure and intellect weren't enemies? What if the body and mind could dance together without shame? Tonight, we'll trace the rise of libertinage from its Renaissance roots to its scandalous flowering in the salons of France, where desire met philosophy and changed the world forever. As you settle in, perhaps you might share in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and the time where you are. I like to picture these stories traveling quietly across the world, finding their way into so many corners of the night. Now, let the room grow softer. Let the light fade. The air grows still. Maybe there's the faint hum of a fan, or the quiet breathing of the night around you. And together, we'll wander slowly, without hurry, into the hidden history of libertinage itself, through candlelit chambers and forbidden salons, where the dangerous idea was born that humans might live freely, love boldly, and think without chains. The Garden of Dangerous Ideas. In the dying light of medieval certainty, as the Renaissance painted new possibilities across the canvas of European thought, a dangerous idea began to take root in the gardens of the learned and the restless. It was 1494, and in the Platonic Academy of Florence, young scholars gathered around flickering candles to discuss texts that their grandfathers would have burned as heretical. The villa sat on a hillside overlooking the Arno. Its terraced gardens descended towards the river in carefully planned stages. Here, among groves of olive trees and beds of herbs that released their perfume into the evening air, the future of European thought was being quietly reshaped. The building itself was modest, a Renaissance merchant's idea of classical simplicity, with clean lines and harmonious proportions that seemed to argue for the possibility of human reason ordering the chaos of existence. Stone paths wound between carefully tended flower beds where roses bloomed alongside medicinal herbs. The very design of the garden reflected the new philosophy taking shape within the villa walls. Nature and cultivation working in harmony. Beauty serving not just aesthetic pleasure, but intellectual inspiration. Water flowed through cleverly designed channels from pool to pool, creating the gentle sound of movement that aids contemplation. Each element had been chosen not just for its individual beauty, but for its contribution to an environment where minds could wander freely among dangerous thoughts. Marsilio Ficino, the Academy's aging founder, moved slowly through the evening shadows, his steps careful on the stone paths that wound between the plantings. At 70, his body had begun to betray him, but his mind remained sharp as the blade of a Damascene sword. He had spent his life walking the razor's edge between innovation and blasphemy, translating the works of Plato into elegant Latin that made the ancient philosopher accessible to a new generation of European minds. His fingers, ink-stained from decades of manuscript work, traced the spine of books that had traveled impossible distances to reach this sanctuary. Greek texts rescued from the flames of Constantinople, Arabic commentaries on Aristotle, Hebrew treatises on mystical philosophy. Each volume represented knowledge that the official universities of Europe preferred to ignore or condemn. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms through the villa's open windows, mingling with the smell of parchment and melting wax. Inside, in rooms lined with manuscripts rescued from Constantinople's fall, young men freed their minds from centuries of constraint. These were the children of merchants and minor nobility, educated in the new learning that emphasized human dignity and potential over divine judgment and human weakness. Their clothing spoke of modest wealth rather than inherited grandeur. Sons of bankers and silk merchants, young men whose fathers had built fortunes through trade and innovation rather than conquest and inheritance. They carried themselves with the confidence of those who believed that intelligence and application could triumph over birth and tradition. Around tables lit by dozens of candles, they bent over texts that revealed a world their teachers had never described. Plato's dialogues spoke of beauty as a reflection of divine truth, of love as a ladder leading the soul toward perfect understanding, of the physical world not as a veil of tears, but as a shadow of eternal forms that could inspire and elevate rather than corrupt and degrade. The manuscripts they studied were works of art in themselves, illuminated with gold leaf and precious pigments. Each page had been copied by hand by scribes who understood that the physical beauty of a book could enhance the beauty of the ideas it contained. The very act of reading became a sensual experience that engaged eye and hand as well as mind. Here, in voices kept low out of caution rather than shame, young scholars began to form a question that would echo through centuries. If the ancients had celebrated both body and soul, if they had seen no necessary conflict between physical beauty and spiritual truth, if they had understood desire as a force that could elevate rather than debase, why had centuries of Christianity insisted that flesh and spirit must be at war? The question hung in the air like incense, dangerous and intoxicating. These young men had been raised on sermons that proclaimed the body to be the enemy of the soul. That taught them to view desire as temptation and pleasure as sin. But here, in the words of Plato himself, they found a different vision. They discovered descriptions of beauty that made no distinction between physical and spiritual attraction. Accounts of love that saw desire as the beginning of wisdom rather than its enemy. Philosophical systems that honored the body as the soul's partner rather than its prison. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, barely 24 but already famous throughout Europe for his learning, was among the most eloquent voices in these evening discussions. His work on the dignity of man, delivered in Rome just 8 years earlier, had proclaimed that humans were unique among God's creatures in possessing the freedom to determine their own nature. Pico had absorbed knowledge from every available source. He spoke Hebrew and Arabic as well as Latin and Greek. He had studied with Jewish scholars in Padua and Arabic philosophers in Paris. His mind was a library of human wisdom that transcended the narrow boundaries of Christian Europe. His presence in these discussions gave them an authority that mere speculation could never achieve. When Pico spoke of human dignity and freedom, he drew upon traditions of thought that stretched back to ancient Egypt and Babylon. His learning transformed adolescent rebellion into sophisticated philosophy. Unlike angels who were fixed in their perfection, or beasts who were bound by instinct, humans could choose to rise toward the divine or sink toward the bestial. But what did this freedom mean in practice? If humans could choose their nature, if they were not bound by the rigid categories that medieval theology had imposed upon them, then perhaps the traditional rules about pleasure and virtue, body and soul, sacred and profane, needed to be reconsidered. Perhaps the path to wisdom did not require the complete suppression of human nature, but its careful cultivation and refinement. The young men gathered in Ficino's villa began to explore what this might mean for their own lives. If they possessed the freedom to determine their own nature, then they also possessed the responsibility to exercise that freedom wisely. The question was not whether to follow desire, but how to follow it in ways that led toward, rather than away from, human flourishing. They developed exercises in what they called the examination of conscience. But unlike the medieval practice of cataloging sins, these examinations focused on understanding the deeper motivations behind their actions. They sought to trace desire to its source, to understand what they truly wanted and why they wanted it. The word that would eventually define this philosophy was already present in their discussions, though it would be decades before it acquired its full meaning. Libertinage derived from libertinus, the Latin term for a freed slave. How fitting that a philosophy of liberation should spring from the language of bondage. These early libertines were not the hedonistic courtiers of popular imagination, but scholars and artists who had freed themselves from the intellectual slavery of unquestioned tradition. They understood that true freedom required not the absence of all constraint, but the choice of better constraints. The slave who broke his chains only to become enslaved to his passions had gained nothing. But the slave who used his freedom to cultivate wisdom and virtue had achieved something precious and rare. They were dangerous precisely because they were thoughtful. A simple rebel might be dismissed or suppressed. But men who could quote Plato and Cicero, who understood theology better than many priests, who could argue their positions with learning and eloquence, such men could not be easily ignored or silenced. Their revolt was not against reason, but for it. Not against morality, but for a morality based on understanding rather than fear. These young scholars possessed the most dangerous weapon in human history: literacy combined with leisure. They could read the classical authors in the original languages. They had time to think about what they read, and they had access to other learned minds who could challenge and refine their thinking. As the nights grew longer and the discussions more bold, these young scholars began to explore ideas that would have horrified their grandfathers. They spoke of the human body not as a prison for the soul, but as its most perfect earthly expression. They discussed pleasure not as the enemy of virtue, but as its potential companion, arguing that the same faculties that could lead to vice might, properly understood and directed, lead to a fuller and more complete human flourishing. The conversations often continued until dawn. Young men who had entered the villa as dutiful students of accepted wisdom would emerge as questioners of everything they had been taught. The transformation was visible in their posture, their speech, their eyes. They had tasted intellectual freedom and found it intoxicating. Their host watched these developments with the careful eye of a gardener tending exotic plants. Ficino understood that ideas, like seeds, needed the right conditions to germinate and grow. Too much attention from the wrong quarters, and these tender shoots of thought might be trampled before they could take root. Too little support, and they might wither from neglect. The balance required constant vigilance and considerable skill. Ficino had learned through hard experience how to nurture dangerous ideas while protecting them from premature exposure. He understood the art of strategic ambiguity, how to present radical thoughts in language that could be interpreted as orthodox by those who needed to see orthodoxy, how to plant seeds of doubt in minds prepared to receive them while offering reassurance to those who feared change. In the margins of the manuscripts they studied, these young men began to make notes that revealed their thinking. Comments on Platonic dialogues explored the relationship between earthly and divine beauty. Annotations to Aristotelian ethics questioned whether virtue necessarily required the suppression of natural desires. References to Cicero and Seneca examined the possibility that pleasure, properly understood, might be compatible with wisdom. These marginal notes would prove to be among the most influential writings of the Renaissance. Future generations of students would discover in them not just commentary on classical texts, but blueprints for new ways of thinking about human nature and human possibility. The handwriting itself told stories. Careful script that became hurried as excitement grew. Ink blots where hands trembled with the implications of what was being written. Crossouts and corrections that revealed minds wrestling with ideas too large for easy expression. These marginal notes, preserved in libraries throughout Europe, would be read by future generations of students who found in them permission to think thoughts that had been unthinkable to their predecessors. The influence of these ideas spread slowly at first, carried by young men who returned to their native cities with minds transformed by what they had learned in Florence. Letters between scholars carried these concepts across the Alps and the Pyrenees. A young Frenchman studying in Italy would write to a friend in Paris, describing new ways of understanding classical texts. A German student would return to his university carrying books that reinterpreted Christian doctrine in light of ancient wisdom. The postal system of Renaissance Europe became a nervous system for the transmission of dangerous ideas, messages written in code, books hidden in diplomatic pouches, conversations conducted in Latin to evade the understanding of those who might report them to authorities. Slowly, quietly, the intellectual map of Europe was being redrawn. Each letter was a seed that might sprout into a new academy, a new circle of questioners, a new challenge to established authority. The young men trained in Ficino's methods became teachers themselves, carrying his techniques of inquiry to universities and courts throughout the continent. The physical setting of these discussions was itself part of their meaning. The villa's gardens, with their careful balance of cultivation and naturalness, embodied a philosophy that saw no necessary conflict between human art and natural beauty. The terraces that stepped down toward the river demonstrated that human beings could shape their environment without destroying it, could impose order without crushing life. Every element of the garden had been chosen to support contemplation. Paths that curved gently to slow the walker's pace. Benches placed at points where the view invited reflection. Trees planted to provide shade without blocking light. Water features that created soothing sounds without overwhelming conversation. In the late evening, when formal discussions had ended and most of the company had retired, a few would linger in the garden under stars that seemed closer and brighter than they did in the cities below. Here, in whispered conversations that would have been impossible in daylight, they began to sketch the outlines of a philosophy that would eventually challenge every assumption about how human beings should live. They spoke of love not as a weakness to be overcome, but as a force to be understood and channeled. They discussed beauty not as a temptation to be avoided, but as a revelation to be contemplated. They explored the possibility that the human body, far from being the soul's prison, might be its most eloquent expression. That physical pleasure might be not the enemy of spiritual development, but its companion and guide. These midnight conversations were the most dangerous of all. Here, freed from the need to maintain scholarly detachment, young men could speak from their hearts as well as their minds. They could confess their own desires and struggles. They could admit their hunger for experiences that went beyond mere intellectual understanding. These ideas took shape slowly, tested against classical texts and Christian doctrine, refined through debate and discussion, polished by minds trained in the finest traditions of humanist learning. They were not crude rebellions against established authority, but sophisticated attempts to reconcile ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding, to find ways of living that honored both human dignity and human nature. The scholars at Ficino's Academy understood that they were participating in something larger than academic exercise. They were helping to create a new image of human possibility, one that would influence art, literature, politics, and personal relationships for centuries to come. The Courtly Garden. The court of Francis I in the early 16th century was a place where time seemed to move differently, where the seasons of the heart mattered more than the seasons of war. Here, in the Chateau of Fontainebleau, courtiers would rise late, dine long, and spend their afternoons in pursuits that would have puzzled their medieval ancestors. It was a world where leisure had become an art form, and where the art of living was being reinvented with each passing season. The transformation from medieval to Renaissance court life was visible in every detail. Where once knights had gathered to plan battles and divide spoils, now courtiers assembled to discuss poetry and philosophy. Where armor had hung from walls, now tapestries depicted scenes from classical mythology. Where the talk had been of honor won through violence, now it was of grace achieved through refinement. The king himself set the tone. Francis I was a man who collected beautiful objects with the same passion that his predecessors had collected territories. His galleries filled with paintings from Italy, where artists had rediscovered the human form in all its glory. Francis understood that power in the new age would come not just from military might, but from cultural prestige. A king who could attract the finest artists and thinkers would command respect that no amount of mere wealth could purchase. He invested in beauty the way his ancestors had invested in castles. The royal collections grew with each diplomatic mission to Italy. Paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, sculptures by Michelangelo, books illuminated by the finest manuscripts. Each acquisition was a statement about the kind of civilization Francis intended to create. Visitors to Fontainebleau would find themselves surrounded by images of gods and goddesses who seemed to celebrate rather than condemn physical beauty. The frescoes that decorated the chateau's galleries told stories from classical mythology with a frankness that would have shocked earlier generations. Here was Jupiter pursuing mortal women. There was Venus instructing mortals in the arts of love. Everywhere the message was clear. The gods themselves had sanctioned the pursuit of beauty and pleasure. In this atmosphere, ideas that had been whispered in Florentine academies could be spoken more openly. The chateau became a kind of laboratory where traditional boundaries between sacred and profane, spiritual and physical, proper and improper, could be examined with the careful attention that scholars once reserved for ancient texts. The very architecture of the chateau reflected this new philosophy. Rooms flowed into one another in ways that encouraged movement and interaction. Windows were larger and more numerous than in medieval buildings, flooding interiors with light that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between inside and outside, private and public. Gardens were designed as outdoor rooms where courtiers could walk and talk in privacy while remaining visible to others. The landscape itself became a stage for the performance of refined sociability. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533. A young woman of 14 whose marriage to the future Henry II would bring more than political alliance. In the trunks that followed her from Florence came books, letters, and most importantly, ways of thinking that had been shaped by generations of Renaissance humanism. Catherine was a Medici, heir to the family that had sponsored Ficino's academy and supported the greatest artists of the Renaissance. She carried in her blood and in her education the accumulated wisdom of the Florentine humanist tradition. Her dowry included not just gold and territory, but ideas. The marriage negotiations had been conducted like diplomatic treaties, with careful attention to what each side would gain. But the most valuable exchange was cultural rather than material. Catherine brought to France sophistication that could not be purchased with money. Her retinue included not just servants and guards, but scholars and artists who understood that their role was to transplant Florentine culture to French soil. They came prepared to create a new kind of court life that would rival anything in Italy. Her private apartments, when she finally had the power to decorate them as she wished, told a story that careful observers could read. The frescoes commissioned from Italian masters depicted scenes from classical mythology with a frankness that made their meaning unmistakable. Here was Diana the huntress. There, Venus rising from the sea. Everywhere the celebration of beauty unashamed and desire unafraid. Catherine understood that decoration was a form of education. The images that surrounded her courtiers would shape their thoughts and desires in subtle but powerful ways. By surrounding herself with representations of classical gods and goddesses, she was teaching a curriculum of human possibility that no university could match. But it was in the conversations that took place in these rooms that the real revolution occurred. Catherine gathered around herself men and women who understood that ideas, like wines, needed time to mature. Her gatherings, though they did not yet bear the name salon, became places where philosophy and flirtation could mingle without scandal, where serious questions about human nature could be explored through the medium of refined entertainment. The art of conversation was cultivated with the same care that gardeners brought to the cultivation of exotic flowers. Participants learned to approach dangerous topics indirectly through wit and metaphor. They developed codes and signals that allowed them to communicate ideas that could not be stated directly. These early salons were schools for the education of desire. Participants learned to recognize and articulate feelings that had no names in the official vocabulary of their time. They developed new languages for discussing the relationship between love and friendship, passion and virtue, individual fulfillment and social responsibility. The Château of Fontainebleau, with its long galleries perfect for promenading and its intimate chambers ideal for private conversation, became a stage set for the performance of new possibilities. Courtiers learned to walk differently here, to speak with new kinds of wit, to look upon beauty without the reflexive shame that centuries of Christianity had taught them to feel. The very act of walking through the Château's galleries became a kind of education. Courtiers would pause before paintings that depicted classical myths, using the stories they portrayed as starting points for discussions about contemporary life. Art became a vocabulary for exploring ideas that could not be discussed directly. Movement itself was choreographed to create opportunities for meaningful interaction. The placement of furniture, the arrangement of rooms, the design of gardens, all served to bring people together in combinations that might lead to interesting conversations. Marguerite de Navarre, the king's sister, embodied this new sensibility in her very person. She was pious without being prudish, learned without being pedantic, passionate without being crude. Her court at Nérac became a kind of sister institution to Fontainebleau, a place where the boundaries between spiritual and earthly love could be explored with unprecedented sophistication. Marguerite possessed the rare combination of royal status and genuine intellectual curiosity that made her an ideal patron of the new learning. She could protect scholars and artists from persecution while also challenging them to push their ideas in bold new directions. Her library was one of the finest in France, filled with works that she had commissioned or collected during her travels. She read Latin and Greek as well as French, and corresponded with humanist scholars throughout Europe. Her learning gave her authority that even male intellectuals had to respect. Her work that would become the Heptameron, begun in the 1540s, would become a masterpiece of this new literature. Ostensibly a collection of moral tales told by travelers stranded at an abbey during a flood, it actually explored every variety of human desire with a psychological penetration that had no precedent in European literature. The Heptameron was modeled on Boccaccio's Decameron, but Marguerite's work was more psychologically sophisticated and morally complex than its Italian predecessor. Where Boccaccio had been content to entertain, Marguerite sought to educate and enlighten. Each story was followed by discussion among the fictional narrators, conversations that modeled the kind of sophisticated moral reasoning that characterized the new court culture. These discussions revealed how educated people might approach questions of love, desire, and personal conduct without falling into either crude hedonism or rigid moralism. The characters in Marguerite's work demonstrated that it was possible to take human nature seriously without abandoning moral seriousness. These were not the crude discussions of desire that might be heard in taverns or barracks. They were explorations conducted with all the intellectual rigor that scholars brought to questions of theology or natural philosophy, but applied to matters that theology preferred to condemn rather than understand. The result was a new way of thinking about human nature that neither denied its complexity nor demanded its suppression. Marguerite's characters approached moral questions as investigators rather than judges. They sought to understand why people acted as they did, what desires motivated their choices, what circumstances shaped their possibilities. This psychological approach to ethics would become one of the defining characteristics of libertine thought. In the gardens of these chateaux, courtiers would walk slowly along paths designed to encourage contemplation. The very landscape had been shaped to support conversation, with groves that provided privacy, fountains that masked whispered words, and prospect points that offered views inspiring enough to elevate any discussion. The gardens were living laboratories for the study of human nature. Courtiers could observe how different environments affected mood and behavior. They learned to use natural settings to create the emotional conditions that would support different kinds of conversation. Here, in afternoons that stretched toward evening without haste, the foundations were laid for ways of living that would influence European culture for centuries to come. The culture that emerged in these French chateaux was more democratic than its Italian predecessor. Where the Florentine academies had been exclusively masculine, the French courts welcomed women as intellectual equals. Where the Italians had focused primarily on scholarly discussion, the French developed forms of entertainment that engaged both mind and heart. This feminization of intellectual culture would prove to be one of the most important developments in the history of libertinage. Women brought practical knowledge of human psychology that complemented male theoretical learning. They insisted on forms of discourse that honored feeling as well as reason. The philosophy of experience. In the quiet of his tower library in the Périgord, Michel de Montaigne began the work that would give this emerging sensibility its most profound and lasting expression. The essays that he started writing in the 1570s appeared modest enough. The reflections of a retired magistrate on his reading and his experience. But they contained a revolution in human thinking that would reshape not only European philosophy, but European culture itself. The tower where Montaigne wrote had been his father's business office, a place where practical affairs were conducted. By transforming it into a library and study, Montaigne was making a statement about the relationship between thought and action, contemplation and engagement with the world. Montaigne's decision to make himself the subject of his own investigation was more radical than it might seem to modern readers accustomed to autobiography and memoir. Medieval and Renaissance writers had traditionally focused their attention on great figures from history or legend, on saints and heroes whose lives offered moral instruction to ordinary readers. By choosing to examine his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences with the same care that scholars traditionally devoted to ancient texts, Montaigne was making a profound claim about the value and dignity of individual human consciousness. The very word essay that Montaigne chose for his work reflected his experimental approach. Essai in French meant a trial or attempt. Montaigne was not claiming to offer final truths, but to record the results of his attempts to understand himself and the world around him. This modest approach masked a radical method. If individual experience was worth studying with scholarly rigor, then perhaps the experiences of ordinary people were more significant than traditional authorities had assumed. The physical setting of this work was itself significant. Montaigne's library occupied the third floor of a round tower attached to his chateau. a room lined with books and decorated with Greek and Latin mottos that reflected his philosophical commitments. The circular design of the room meant that there were no corners where shadows could gather. Light entered from windows on all sides, creating an environment that seemed to embody the clarity and openness that Montaigne sought in his thinking. From the windows, he could look out over the vineyards and forests of his estate, a landscape that seemed to embody the harmony between human cultivation and natural beauty that his philosophy celebrated. The view reminded him daily that human beings were part of nature rather than separate from it, that the wisdom he sought was not something apart from ordinary life, but something that emerged from patient attention to the details of lived experience. Here, in this sanctuary removed from the demands of public life, Montaigne developed the method that would make his work immortal. He wrote slowly, returning to his essays again and again over the years, adding new thoughts and qualifications with each reading of his own work. The manuscripts of the essays show layers of revision that span decades. Montaigne would return to thoughts he had written years earlier, adding new insights, qualifying old judgments, recording how his thinking had changed with age and experience. This process of continuous revision reflected his understanding that human nature was not fixed, but fluid, not simple, but complex, not reducible to the formulas that traditional morality preferred. Montaigne's method was fundamentally democratic. He assumed that his own experience, carefully observed and honestly reported, would illuminate aspects of human nature that readers would recognize in themselves. He wrote not as an authority speaking down to students, but as one human being addressing others. His famous motto, "Que sais-je?" "What do I know?" seemed humble, but it contained the seeds of intellectual rebellion. If even the most learned man could claim only uncertain knowledge, then who could presume to dictate absolute truths about how others should live? The question mark that followed those two French words opened a space for doubt that would prove impossible to close. The motto appeared everywhere in Montaigne's library, carved into ceiling beams and painted on walls. It served as a constant reminder that the pursuit of knowledge required humility as well as curiosity, that the greatest enemy of understanding was the premature certainty that closed minds to new possibilities. Montaigne's skepticism was not cynical but liberating. If traditional authorities could not provide final answers to life's fundamental questions, then individuals were free to seek their own answers through careful observation and honest reflection. Montaigne's essays on friendship revealed his understanding that human relationships could be based on mutual affection and esteem rather than hierarchical obligation. His famous description of his relationship with Etienne de la Boétie, "because it was he, because it was I," suggested that the deepest human connections transcended rational explanation and conventional category. The friendship between Montaigne and La Boétie had been brief but transformative. La Boétie died young, leaving Montaigne with memories of a relationship that had shown him what human connection could be when freed from the constraints of social convention and personal interest. Such relationships required not the suppression of individual personality, but its full development and expression. Montaigne's analysis of friendship became a model for libertine thinking about all human relationships. If people could connect authentically as friends, perhaps they could also connect authentically as lovers, spouses, and fellow citizens. Perhaps most human problems arose from false relationships based on fear, greed, and conventional obligation rather than genuine affection and mutual respect. His essays on education challenged traditional approaches that emphasized memorization and obedience over critical thinking and individual development. Montaigne argued that the goal of education should be not the production of learned parrots who could recite classical texts, but of thoughtful human beings capable of independent judgment. "We work merely to fill the memory," he wrote, "leaving the understanding and the conscience empty." Montaigne had experienced traditional education himself and found it lacking. He had been forced to memorize vast quantities of Latin poetry and rhetoric without ever being encouraged to think about what the words actually meant. He emerged from his schooling with a head full of classical quotations, but little understanding of how to live wisely. His alternative approach to education emphasized experience over authority, questions over answers, self-knowledge over accumulated information. The educated person was not someone who knew many facts, but someone who understood himself and could think clearly about the challenges of human existence. But it was his essay On Some Verses of Virgil, written when he was nearly 60 and published in the final edition of the Essays, that most clearly revealed the libertine implications of his thinking. Using lines from classical poetry as his starting point, Montaigne explored questions of sexuality and marriage with a frankness that had no precedent in French literature. The essay's title was deceptively modest. Montaigne presented himself as simply commenting on a few lines from a classical poet. But his commentary expanded into a comprehensive examination of human sexuality that challenged every assumption of his time. Writing with the authority of age and the protection of classical illusion, Montaigne argued that sexual desire was a natural and necessary part of human life. He criticized both the Christian tendency to condemn all physical pleasure and the courtly tendency to idealize love beyond human recognition. True wisdom, he suggested, lay in understanding and accepting human nature as it actually was, rather than as moralists insisted it should be. Montaigne's discussion of sexuality was shocking, not because it was crude, but because it was thoughtful. He brought the same careful analysis to questions of physical desire that he applied to questions of friendship, education, and politics. He refused to accept that any aspect of human experience was beneath philosophical consideration. His discussion moved with characteristic meandering from personal reflection to classical citation, from philosophical argument to practical observation. He examined his own experience of love and desire with the same careful attention he brought to his analysis of ancient texts, finding in both sources of insight into the human condition that official doctrine preferred to ignore or condemn. The essay included frank discussions of his own sexual experiences, his changing desires as he aged, his observations about the differences between men and women. He wrote about impotence, adultery, and the gap between romantic ideals and physical realities with a psychological penetration that would not be matched for centuries. The essay's publication created a scandal that extended far beyond France. Church authorities condemned it as immoral, while secular readers found in it a liberation from centuries of guilt and repression. Montaigne had given intellectual respectability to aspects of human experience that had been driven underground by Christian teaching, demonstrating that one could be both learned and sensual, both philosophical and passionate. The implications of Montaigne's method extended far beyond questions of sexuality. By treating his own experience as worthy of philosophical investigation, he had implicitly challenged the entire structure of traditional authority. If individual consciousness was a valid source of truth, if personal observation and reflection could rival the pronouncements of ancient authorities and contemporary experts, then the foundations of medieval civilization had been shaken. Montaigne's approach to self-examination became a model for generations of subsequent thinkers. He showed that introspection could be rigorous without being morbid, honest without being self-indulgent. He demonstrated that the examined life was not just worth living, but was the only life worthy of a rational being. Pierre Charon, Montaigne's friend and disciple, attempted to systematize these insights in his treatise, On Wisdom. Charon argued that human beings could discover moral truths through careful observation of their own nature and the world around them, without need for supernatural guidance or traditional authority. Virtue, he claimed, was not a matter of following external rules, but of understanding and fulfilling one's own nature as a rational being. Charon's work made explicit what had been implicit in Montaigne's essays. If human nature itself was a valid guide to conduct, then traditional sources of moral authority lost their monopoly on truth. Individuals could and should think for themselves about how to live. Such ideas were explosive in their implications. If human nature itself could serve as a guide to proper conduct, then traditional authorities, church, state, established custom, lost their monopoly on moral truth. If pleasure and desire were natural parts of human experience, then systems that demanded their complete suppression stood condemned by their unreasonableness. If individual experience was a valid source of knowledge, then conformity to external standards became a matter of choice rather than obligation. The spread of Montaigne's ideas occurred through networks of correspondence and conversation that connected educated people throughout Europe. His essays were copied, translated, discussed, and debated in universities, courts, and private homes. Each reader became a potential transmitter of his method and his insights. The art of conversation. The 17th century arrived with promises of change that few could yet articulate clearly. In the aftermath of the religious wars that had torn France apart for decades, a new generation sought ways of living that might avoid the fanaticism of their parents. They looked not to the future, which seemed uncertain, nor to the past, which had proven so destructive, but to the present moment. To the possibility of creating spaces where human beings might simply be human without the distorting pressures of ideology or tradition. The wars of religion had shown what happened when philosophical differences were resolved through violence. Neighbor had killed neighbor in the name of theological distinctions that most people could barely understand. The survivors were hungry for forms of discourse that might allow disagreement without bloodshed. The salon was perhaps the most significant cultural innovation of the age, though it emerged so gradually that no one thought to name it until it was already well established. It began with a few women who found the existing forms of social life inadequate to their needs and their intelligence. The women who created the salon tradition were often marginal figures in official society. They might be daughters of wealthy merchants rather than ancient nobility, wives of men whose careers kept them away from home for long periods, widows who had inherited wealth but not official status. their marginality became their strength. Freed from the rigid expectations that constrained women of higher rank, they could experiment with new forms of social life. They had education without official responsibility, leisure without ceremonial obligation. Slowly, carefully, they began to create something new. A space that was neither public nor entirely private, where men and women could meet as intellectual equals to explore ideas that were too dangerous for the university and too refined for the tavern. The creation of these spaces required extraordinary social skill. The women who pioneered the salon tradition had to navigate between competing demands and conflicting expectations. They needed to attract interesting guests without scandalizing respectable society. They had to encourage free discussion without allowing conversations to descend into chaos or controversy. The Hôtel de Rambouillet, the creation of Catherine de Vivonne, Marquise de Rambouillet, became the model that would reshape European social life. The Marquise was a woman who understood that architecture shapes thought, that the arrangement of rooms influences the character of conversations, that the quality of light and the choice of colors could create moods that made certain kinds of discourse possible while discouraging others. Catherine de Vivonne had been born into the French aristocracy, but raised with Italian sophistication. Her mother was Italian, and she had spent her childhood absorbing the cultural refinement that had made Italian courts the envy of Europe. When she married into one of France's most prominent families, she brought with her ideas about how social life might be organized. Her famous blue drawing room, decorated in colors that no one had thought to combine before, created an atmosphere that was simultaneously intimate and formal, serious and playful. The walls were hung with paintings that celebrated beauty without apology. The furniture arranged to facilitate conversation rather than display wealth. The lighting designed to flatter faces while encouraging the kind of half shadows that made confidential discourse possible. The choice of blue was revolutionary. Blue had been considered a masculine color, associated with military uniforms and official ceremonies. By decorating her salon in various shades of blue and silver, the Marquise was claiming masculine prerogatives for feminine space. She was announcing that women could be serious thinkers as well as decorative objects. Every detail had been chosen with care. The height of chair seats encouraged conversation by bringing faces to the same level. The arrangement of furniture created intimate groupings while maintaining sight lines that allowed the hostess to monitor all conversations. Even the selection of flowers was calculated to provide fragrance without overwhelming the sense. Here, beginning in the 1620s, conversation became an art practiced with the same devotion that others brought to painting or music. The Marquise and her guests developed their own vocabulary, their own rhythms, their own unwritten rules about what could be said and how it might be expressed. They discovered that ideas which seemed dangerous when stated directly could be explored safely when approached through wit, metaphor, and careful indirection. The art of salon conversation required skills that no university taught. Participants learned to read facial expressions and body language, to sense when a topic was becoming too controversial or when a guest was feeling excluded, to redirect conversations that were heading in dangerous directions without appearing to censor them. The most successful salon conversationalists developed an almost musical sense of rhythm and timing. They knew when to speak and when to listen, when to introduce new topics, and when to allow discussions to develop naturally. They understood that conversation was a collaborative art form that required contributions from all participants. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Visitors noticed that conversations at the Hôtel de Rambouillet were somehow different from those they encountered elsewhere. People listened more carefully, spoke more thoughtfully, developed ideas more fully. The competitive display of learning that characterized university discourse gave way to collaborative exploration of complex questions. The crude sexual banter that marked masculine gatherings was replaced by sophisticated analysis of human psychology and desire. Men who had never considered that women might have interesting ideas found themselves drawn into conversations that challenged their assumptions. Women who had been taught to defer to masculine authority discovered that their insights were valued and respected. The salon created a space where intellectual and emotional freedom could coexist with exquisite refinement. Guests learned to be simultaneously sincere and sophisticated, to reveal themselves while maintaining elegance, to explore controversial topics while avoiding crude confrontation. It was a performance that required intelligence, sensitivity, and a kind of social courage that few possessed, but many could learn to cultivate. The salon developed its own social codes and conventions. Guests learned to dress appropriately, neither too formally nor too casually. They mastered the art of making entrances and exits that did not disrupt ongoing conversations. They developed skills in reading the social dynamics of groups and positioning themselves effectively within them. Within this protected atmosphere, libertinage could develop in new directions that would have been impossible in more traditional settings. Salon conversations explored the nature of friendship between men and women, a radical concept in an age when such relationships were presumed to be either impossible or improper. They examined the possibility of love without marriage, of passion without possession, of relationships based on mutual esteem rather than legal obligation or economic necessity. These discussions were conducted with such refinement that their subversive implications were often hidden beneath layers of wit and politeness. A casual observer might have seen only fashionable entertainment, but careful listeners could detect ideas that challenged every assumption about how men and women should relate to each other and to society. The salon had created a kind of laboratory where social experiments could be conducted safely, where new forms of human relationship could be tested without immediate consequences. Topics that could not be discussed directly were approached through literature and philosophy. Conversations about contemporary relationships were conducted through analysis of classical texts or fictional characters. This indirection allowed dangerous ideas to be explored without the participants having to commit themselves to specific positions. Madame de Rambouillet gathered around her a circle that included the greatest writers and thinkers of the age. Honoré d'Urfé, whose massive pastoral novel L'Astrée had been appearing in volumes since 1607, was a regular visitor. D'Urfé was a man who understood that literature could be a form of philosophy. His novel was not just entertainment, but education, a guide to the psychological complexities of love and desire that his readers could apply to their own lives. His work explored the psychology of love with unprecedented sophistication, creating characters who debated questions of passion and duty, desire and honor in conversations that served as models for real-life salon discussions. The characters in L'Astray faced dilemmas that had no easy solutions. They were forced to choose between competing loyalties, to balance personal desires against social obligations, to navigate the complexities of relationships that did not fit conventional categories. Their struggles provided a vocabulary for discussing contemporary problems that could not be addressed directly. The novel's influence extended far beyond literature into the realm of actual social practice. Readers learned from D'Urfey's characters how to think about love as something more complex than either Christian moralists or popular literature suggested. They discovered that relationships between men and women might be based on intellectual compatibility as well as physical attraction. That desire might be refined rather than simply indulged or suppressed. That the pursuit of love could be a form of self-cultivation rather than self-destruction. Vincent Voiture, the son of a provincial wine merchant who had become one of the salon's most valued members, demonstrated that wit and intelligence could triumph over birth and wealth. His letters, circulated in manuscript among salon members and copied throughout Europe, became models of the art of elegant expression. Voiture's background made him an unlikely salon star. His father sold wine to local taverns, a respectable but unglamorous occupation. Vincent had received a good education, but he lacked the family connections that usually open doors to aristocratic society. He showed that even the most everyday subjects could be treated with a lightness and grace that elevated both writer and reader. That conversation itself could become a form of literature. Voiture's letters demonstrated that intelligence and charm could create their own form of nobility. His wordplay, his ability to find unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated topics, his talent for flattering his correspondents without seeming obsequious, all marked him as a master of the new arts of sociability. The salon also created new opportunities for women to exercise intellectual and social influence in a society that generally excluded them from formal education and public life. Here was a space where intelligence and wit could triumph over official status, where women like Madame de Sablé and the young Mademoiselle de Scudéry could become arbiters of taste and thought, their opinions sought by the most prominent men of their time. These women developed new forms of authority based on cultural rather than political power. They could not hold public office or control large fortunes, but they could shape opinion and influence behavior through their mastery of the arts of conversation and correspondence. Julie d'Angennes, the Marquise's daughter, became the focal point of salon worship. Celebrated in verse by dozens of poets who competed to capture her beauty and intelligence in memorable form. But this was not the crude objectification that characterized much masculine poetry. The celebration of Julie represented something new. The recognition that a woman could be valued for her mind as much as her appearance. That intelligence and beauty were not incompatible. That feminine wisdom might have insights to offer that masculine learning had missed. The poetry written in Julie's honor created a new literary genre. The poems were exercises in wit and refinement, rather than expressions of crude desire. They demonstrated that men could admire women without seeking to possess or dominate them. This feminization of intellectual culture had profound implications for the development of libertinage. women brought to these discussions a practical knowledge of the costs of sexual and social conformity that male philosophers could only theorize about. They understood, in ways that abstract thinkers did not, how traditional arrangements affected actual human beings attempting to live authentic lives. Women's perspectives on questions of love and marriage were shaped by their direct experience of the limitations imposed by conventional arrangements. They knew what it meant to be traded like property in marriage negotiations, to be valued primarily for their ability to produce heirs, to be excluded from most forms of public life. The literary works that emerged from salon culture reflected these new concerns and perspectives. Madame de Lafayette's The Princess of Clèves, published anonymously in 1678, explored the inner life of a woman torn between duty and desire with psychological depth that had no precedent in European literature. The novel's heroine faced a dilemma that had no satisfactory solution within the constraints of her society. She could neither fulfill her desires without destroying her reputation, nor suppress them without destroying her authenticity. Her struggle represented the predicament of anyone who sought to live honestly in a dishonest world. Her heroine's ultimate choice, to withdraw from society rather than compromise her integrity, provided a model for authentic living that influenced generations of readers. The Princess of Clèves demonstrated that it was possible to write about psychological complexity without sacrificing moral seriousness. The novel showed that libertine insights about human nature could be applied to create literature that was both intellectually sophisticated and emotionally moving. The précieuses, those salon women who insisted on refinement in language and behavior, were often mocked by contemporary satirists like Molière, but their influence was profound and lasting. By insisting that women deserved respect as intellectual beings, that love should involve mental as well as physical attraction, and that social relationships should be based on mutual esteem rather than hierarchical submission, they laid groundwork for more radical challenges to traditional authority that would emerge in later centuries. The précieuses developed new vocabularies for discussing relationships and emotions. They created words for feelings that had previously been unnamed, distinctions between different types of love and friendship that allowed for more precise analysis of human relationships. Salon culture also developed new forms of literary expression specifically suited to libertine themes. The maxim, perfected by La Rochefoucauld, became a vehicle for expressing cynical insights about human nature in polished, memorable form. La Rochefoucauld's maxims were distillations of salon wisdom. Each one captured an observation about human behavior that had emerged from years of careful social observation. They were literary equivalents of scientific laws, attempts to identify patterns in human behavior that could be stated with mathematical precision. The letter, whether real correspondence or fictional epistle, allowed for intimate exploration of thoughts and feelings that could not be expressed in more public forms. The memoir provided a model for honest self-examination that challenged traditional assumptions about moral perfection and social conformity. These new literary forms reflected the salon's emphasis on psychological analysis and social observation. They were tools for understanding human nature that complemented the conversational techniques developed in actual salon gatherings. The salon had demonstrated that it was possible to create forms of social life based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical domination, on intellectual exchange rather than economic transaction, on the cultivation of human possibility rather than its suppression. These were lessons that would prove difficult for the larger society to learn, but the example had been set. Somewhere in France, it was possible to live differently, to think freely, to love authentically, to be fully human without apology or disguise. The salon tradition spread throughout Europe as visitors to Paris carried news of these new forms of social life back to their home countries. Similar gatherings emerged in London, Berlin, Vienna, and other major cities, each adapted to local conditions, but sharing the fundamental insight that conversation could be a form of art and education. The dangerous game. The middle decades of the 18th century witnessed libertinage reaching both its highest artistic achievement and its most troubling implications. The society that had created spaces for intellectual freedom and aesthetic refinement also produced individuals who used libertine ideas to justify behavior that shocked even sophisticated observers. This period would test whether libertine philosophy could maintain its commitment to human flourishing when pushed to its logical extremes. The aristocratic culture of 18th century France had evolved into something unprecedented in European history. Never before had a leisure class possessed such wealth, such education, such freedom from traditional constraints. Never before had so many people had so much time to devote to the cultivation of pleasure and the exploration of desire. This freedom created extraordinary opportunities for human development. It also created extraordinary temptations for human corruption. Dangerous Liaisons by Choderlos de Laclos appeared in 1782 as the ultimate exploration of libertine psychology and practice. The novel's protagonists, the Marquise de Merteuil and the Vicomte de Valmont, represented libertinage pushed beyond the boundaries of moral consideration into realms of pure manipulation and strategic cruelty. Laclos had spent years observing the libertine society of his time, taking careful notes on the conversations and behaviors that revealed the gap between libertine theory and libertine practice. Working as a military engineer stationed in various provincial towns, he had the perspective of both insider and outsider. Familiar enough with aristocratic culture to understand its subtleties, but detached enough to see its contradictions clearly. As a military man from a middle-class background, Laclos had been admitted to aristocratic society but never fully accepted by it. This marginal position gave him the perfect vantage point for observing the games that the wealthy and powerful played with each other and with those less fortunate than themselves. The novel took the form of letters exchanged between characters whose relationships revealed the complex psychology of power, desire, and authenticity that lurked beneath the surface of polite society. The Marquise de Merteuil and the Vicomte de Valmont were not merely practitioners of sexual freedom, but systematic students of human nature who used their knowledge to manipulate others with scientific precision. The epistolary form allowed Laclos to reveal the gap between public performance and private motivation. His characters wrote differently to different correspondents, adapting their personas to achieve specific effects. The novel became a masterclass in the arts of deception and manipulation. Their correspondence revealed minds that had completely freed themselves from conventional moral categories, viewing all human behavior as material for their experiments in pleasure and power. They had taken libertine skepticism about traditional values and transformed it into a comprehensive program for the exploitation of human weakness and social hypocrisy. Merteuil and Valmont represented the dark potential of libertine education. They had learned all the lessons that salon culture had to teach about human psychology and social dynamics. But they had applied this knowledge in the service of their own egos, rather than in pursuit of wisdom or happiness. Their intelligence was genuine, their psychological insights accurate, their understanding of social mechanisms sophisticated. But they had used their gifts to create a private world in which other people existed only as objects to be manipulated for their amusement. Yet Laclos was not simply celebrating libertine achievement. His novel used these characters to explore the costs as well as the possibilities of complete moral freedom. The Marquise de Merteuil, despite her intelligence and sophistication, was ultimately revealed as a monster of egoism who destroyed everything she touched. Her brilliant analysis of social psychology served primarily to increase her power over others rather than to enhance her own humanity or theirs. Merteuil's letters revealed a woman who had analyzed the position of women in 18th century society with ruthless clarity. She understood exactly how limited her options were, how much her worth depended on her reputation, how precarious her social position remained despite her intelligence and wealth. Her Libertinage was partly a response to these limitations, an attempt to claim power in a world that offered women few legitimate sources of authority. But her response had transformed her into something inhuman. In her determination to avoid being victimized by others, she had become a victimizer herself. Her refusal to accept the constraints placed on women had led her to reject all moral constraints whatsoever. Valmont, for all his charm and wit, proved incapable of genuine love when he finally encountered it in his relationship with Madame de Tourvel. His libertine education had taught him to see all relationships as strategic contests rather than opportunities for authentic connection. When faced with the possibility of real intimacy, he chose familiar patterns of conquest and abandonment that ultimately destroyed both his victim and himself. Valmont's tragedy was that he had become so skilled at performing passion that he had lost the ability to feel it. His techniques for seduction were so polished, his understanding of psychology so sophisticated, that he could no longer distinguish between authentic emotion and calculated effect. The novel became a sensation throughout Europe precisely because it combined the thrill of moral transgression with the satisfaction of moral judgment. Readers could vicariously experience the pleasures of libertine sophistication while simultaneously condemning its consequences. The work served as both handbook and warning, demonstrating the intellectual possibilities of libertine philosophy while revealing its potential for moral catastrophe. The novel's success revealed the ambivalent attitude that 18th century society had developed toward its own libertine culture. People were simultaneously fascinated and repelled by the possibilities that libertine ideas had opened up. The philosophical implications of dangerous liaison extended far beyond its immediate narrative. The novel suggested that complete moral relativism might be psychologically impossible to sustain, that human beings required some form of authentic connection to others, and that the pursuit of power over people ultimately corrupted the pursuer as much as the victims. But the book also revealed the extraordinary psychological sophistication that libertine culture had achieved by the 1780s. The analysis of motivation, the understanding of social dynamics, the recognition of the gap between conscious intention and unconscious desire, all reflected decades of careful observation and theoretical refinement. Libertine thinkers had developed tools for understanding human behavior that would not be matched by academic psychology for another century. Laclos had absorbed the insights of Montaigne and La Rochefoucauld, the psychological sophistication of salon culture, the analytical methods developed by libertine philosophers. His novel represented the culmination of centuries of thinking about human nature. The Marquis de Sade, writing from his prison cell in the Bastille and later in Charenton, pushed libertine philosophy to its ultimate extreme. His works explored the implications of complete moral relativism with a logical rigor that terrified even committed libertines. If all values were conventional, if all moral systems were arbitrary, if pleasure was the only genuine good, then perhaps even the most extreme behaviors could be justified by sufficiently sophisticated reasoning. Sade had been imprisoned not for his writings, which were largely unknown during his lifetime, but for his behavior. His sexual practices, involving servants and prostitutes in scenarios that combined elaborate cruelty with philosophical justification, had scandalized even the tolerant society of pre-revolutionary France. But his theoretical works, produced during long years of confinement, revealed a mind that had followed libertine premises to conclusions that few others had dared to contemplate. Sade's imprisonment gave him unlimited time to think and write. Cut off from the social world that had shaped his behavior, he was free to explore the logical implications of ideas that others preferred to leave unexamined. His 120 Days of Sodom, written in the Bastille during 37 nights in 1785, catalogued every conceivable form of sexual behavior with scientific thoroughness and philosophical commentary. His characters, freed from all moral restraints by wealth and power, discovered that the pursuit of sensation could become an end in itself, independent of any consideration for the welfare of others or even themselves. The work was a thought experiment carried to its logical extreme. If human beings were truly free to pursue their desires without constraint, if they possessed unlimited power over others, if they acknowledged no authority higher than their own will, what would they become? Yet Sade's apparent nihilism contained elements of genuine moral philosophy. His exploration of extreme behavior was conducted with intellectual rigor that revealed the assumptions underlying conventional morality. By pushing libertine ideas to their breaking point, he forced readers to confront questions about human nature and social organization that more moderate thinkers preferred to avoid. Sade's work suggested that human beings might not be capable of handling unlimited freedom, that some constraints might be necessary not just for social order, but for individual sanity. His characters, freed from all external limitations, became slaves to their own appetites. The reactions to Sade's work within libertine circles were tellingly divided. Some saw in his extremism the logical conclusion of their own premises, and welcomed his brutal honesty about the implications of complete moral freedom. Others recognized that his work threatened to discredit the entire libertine project by associating it with genuine cruelty and madness. The debate over Sade's significance revealed fundamental tensions within libertine philosophy that had been developing for decades. Was the goal of libertinage simply the maximization of individual pleasure, regardless of social consequences? Or did it represent a more sophisticated attempt to understand human nature in ways that might ultimately benefit everyone? Could libertine skepticism about traditional morality lead to better ways of living, or would it inevitably result in the kind of nihilistic exploitation that Sade's characters practiced? These questions became more urgent as the political crisis that would lead to the French Revolution intensified during the 1780s. Libertine ideas about individual freedom and the artificial nature of social conventions seemed to support revolutionary demands for equality and justice. But libertine practice, as exemplified by figures like Sade and the protagonists of Dangerous Liaisons, suggested that the destruction of traditional authorities might lead not to liberation, but to new forms of tyranny exercised by those sophisticated enough to manipulate others without moral restraint. The aristocratic libertines of the 1780s found themselves in an impossible position. Their critique of traditional authority had helped prepare the intellectual ground for revolution, but their own privileged status made them targets of revolutionary anger. Many libertines welcomed the early stages of the revolution as vindication of their ideas about human equality and social reform, but they soon discovered that revolutionary virtue could be as intolerant as aristocratic vice, that the destruction of traditional authorities did not automatically lead to greater freedom. The revolutionary moment and beyond. The political revolution that began in 1789 intersected with libertinage in ways that neither libertine philosophers nor revolutionary leaders had anticipated. Many libertine thinkers welcomed the revolution as the political expression of ideas they had long advocated. The overthrow of traditional authorities, the triumph of reason over custom, the liberation of human potential from artificial constraints imposed by church and monarchy. The early days of the revolution seemed to vindicate libertine insights about the artificial nature of social hierarchies and the possibility of reorganizing society according to rational principles. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed that all people were born free and equal, that governments derived their authority from popular consent, that individual liberty was a natural right that could not be legitimately suppressed by traditional authorities. These principles aligned closely with libertine philosophy, which had long argued that conventional moral and social arrangements were human inventions rather than divine commands. If aristocratic privilege was simply a matter of historical accident rather than natural superiority, if religious authority rested on claims that could not be rationally demonstrated, if traditional gender roles were cultural constructions rather than biological necessities, then perhaps all of these arrangements could be changed by human will and intelligence. The revolution seemed to prove that societies could be transformed through rational planning, that human beings were not bound by the arrangements they had inherited from the past. That progress was possible through the application of reason to social problems. Some libertines, like Talleyrand, adapted successfully to the revolutionary environment, using their skills in social navigation to survive and even prosper amid changing circumstances. Talleyrand's ability to serve successive regimes while maintaining his personal freedom and intellectual independence demonstrated that libertine flexibility could be an asset in times of political upheaval. Talleyrand understood that political systems were human constructions that could be changed when they no longer served human needs. His willingness to serve different governments reflected not cynicism, but a pragmatic recognition that principles could be preserved even when institutions changed. His chateau at Valençay became a refuge for other members of the former aristocracy who shared his pragmatic approach to political change. Here, in an environment that preserved the conversational sophistication of the old salons while accommodating the political necessities of the new order, exiled libertines developed strategies for cultural survival that would influence European intellectual life for decades to come. These gatherings demonstrated that libertine culture could adapt to changed circumstances without losing its essential character. The art of conversation, the commitment to rational inquiry, the appreciation of beauty and pleasure, all could survive political revolution. But the revolution's development also revealed fundamental tensions within libertine thought that had not been fully apparent during its salon phase. The demand for civic virtue that characterized revolutionary rhetoric sat uneasily with libertine skepticism about moral absolutes. The emphasis on equality and popular sovereignty conflicted with the aristocratic assumptions that had shaped libertine culture for centuries. The call for patriotic sacrifice challenged libertine focus on individual fulfillment and personal authenticity. Revolutionary leaders like Robespierre spoke of virtue in ways that would have seemed familiar to medieval moralists. They demanded that citizens subordinate their personal desires to the general will, that they embrace self-sacrifice as the highest form of morality, that they conform to standards of behavior determined by political authorities. This revolutionary moralism was in many ways more restrictive than the traditional authorities that libertines had long criticized. At least the old regime had been hypocritical enough to allow private spaces where alternative values could be pursued. The revolution demanded total commitment to its ideals. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette marked the end of the courtly culture that had nurtured libertinage since the Renaissance. The salons that had provided protected spaces for intellectual and moral experimentation were replaced by political clubs that demanded ideological conformity. The refined skepticism that had characterized libertine thought gave way to revolutionary enthusiasm that brooked no dissent from official doctrine. The physical destruction of aristocratic culture was systematic and thorough. Libraries were burned, artworks destroyed, chateaux demolished or converted to other uses. The material infrastructure that had supported libertine intellectual life for centuries was dismantled in the name of equality and revolutionary justice. Many libertines found themselves caught between competing loyalties and incompatible worldviews. Their philosophical commitment to individual freedom put them at odds with revolutionary demands for collective action. Their aristocratic background made them suspects in a movement that increasingly defined itself against privilege and tradition. Their cosmopolitan outlook conflicted with the growing nationalism that characterized revolutionary politics. Some libertines attempted to reconcile their individualist philosophy with revolutionary politics by arguing that true individual freedom could only be achieved in a just society. But this argument required them to accept limitations on immediate personal liberty in the name of future collective liberation. The Marquis de Sade, released from prison by the revolution, initially embraced the new order with characteristic extremism. He served as a section president in Paris, making speeches that celebrated the destruction of traditional authorities and the liberation of human potential from artificial constraints. But his revolutionary enthusiasm was indistinguishable from his libertine philosophy. Both represented complete rejection of conventional moral categories in favor of pure will and desire. Said's revolutionary career demonstrated both the compatibility and the incompatibility of libertine ideas with radical politics. His rejection of traditional authorities aligned perfectly with revolutionary ideology, but his individualistic focus on personal liberation conflicted with demands for collective sacrifice and social solidarity. His philosophical materialism supported revolutionary attacks on religious authority, but his aristocratic habits and aesthetic preferences marked him as suspect in an increasingly egalitarian movement. The terror that began in 1793 revealed the potential for revolutionary virtue to become as oppressive as the traditional authorities it had displaced. The same logic that justified overthrowing kings and nobles in the name of popular sovereignty could also justify suppressing individual dissent in the name of collective will. Libertines who had welcomed the destruction of religious and aristocratic authority found themselves facing new forms of ideological control that were potentially more intrusive than anything they had previously experienced. The revolutionary government claimed the right to regulate not just public behavior, but private thoughts and feelings. Citizens were expected to demonstrate their patriotism through emotional displays that left no room for the kind of ironic detachment that had characterized libertine culture. Many libertine texts were caught up in the revolutionary campaign against aristocratic culture. Libraries were ransacked, manuscripts destroyed, artworks defaced or stolen. The physical infrastructure that had supported libertine intellectual life for centuries was systematically dismantled by revolutionaries who saw it as part of the corrupt system they were trying to replace. The destruction was not just material, but intellectual. Revolutionary ideology promoted forms of thinking that were incompatible with libertine sophistication. Where libertines had celebrated complexity and ambiguity, revolutionaries demanded clarity and commitment. Where libertines had insisted on the importance of individual perspective, revolutionaries promoted collective truth. Yet, libertinage survived the revolution by adapting to new circumstances, demonstrating the flexibility that had always been one of its defining characteristics. The Directory period between 1795 and 1799 saw a revival of libertine culture in new forms that reflected changed political and social conditions. Madame Tallien and Josephine de Beauharnais presided over salons that combined political influence with social freedom, creating environments where libertine ideals could be pursued within the constraints of post-revolutionary society. These new salons were more democratic than their predecessors, welcoming people who had risen to prominence through revolutionary politics rather than inherited privilege. But they maintained the essential libertine commitment to conversation as an art form and the cultivation of pleasure as a legitimate human goal. The new bourgeois elite that emerged from the revolution proved as eager as the old aristocracy to explore the possibilities of moral and intellectual freedom. Having achieved political power through merit rather than birth, they felt entitled to question other traditional arrangements that might limit their opportunities for self-development and self-expression. The revolutionary principle of careers open to talent had created a new class of educated and ambitious individuals who shared many of the aspirations that had motivated aristocratic libertines. They too wanted lives that offered more than mere survival and reproduction. Napoleon's rise to power created both new opportunities and new constraints for libertine expression. The emperor himself embodied many libertine characteristics: skepticism about conventional morality, confidence in individual will and intelligence, appreciation for aesthetic beauty and sensual pleasure. But his authoritarian political system left little room for the kind of free inquiry and experimental living that libertinage required. Napoleon understood the value of libertine sophistication for diplomatic and cultural purposes. He surrounded himself with individuals who possessed the social skills and intellectual flexibility that effective governance required. But he also insisted that these talents be subordinated to his political goals. Libertine culture adapted by becoming more private, more literary, and more focused on personal rather than social transformation. The salon tradition continued in modified form, but participants were more careful about what they said and to whom they said it. The exploration of human nature continued, but it took forms that were less likely to attract official attention or political persecution. The Napoleonic period saw the emergence of new forms of libertine expression that emphasized psychological exploration over social criticism. Writers like Benjamin Constant developed novels that analyzed the internal dynamics of love and desire with unprecedented sophistication while avoiding direct political commentary. The Romantic flowering and modern transformation. The early 19th century brought a fundamental transformation in how libertine ideas were understood and expressed. The Romantic movement that swept across Europe after 1800 drew heavily upon libertine insights while adapting them to new cultural and political circumstances. The cold rationalism that had characterized Enlightenment libertinage gave way to a more emotional and intuitive approach to questions of freedom, authenticity, and human fulfillment. The Romantic movement emerged partly as a reaction against the rationalist optimism of the 18th century. The French Revolution had demonstrated that reason alone was not sufficient to create just societies. The Napoleonic Wars had shown that human nature contained depths of passion and violence that rational analysis could not fully explain or control. Romantic thinkers retained the libertine commitment to individual freedom and authentic self-expression, while rejecting the belief that these goals could be achieved through purely rational means. They emphasized feeling over thinking, intuition over analysis, passion over prudence. George Sand, born Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupin in 1804, embodied this romantic transformation of libertine ideals in both her life and her literary work. Growing up on her grandmother's estate in the Berry region of central France, she absorbed the cultural sophistication of the old aristocracy, while also witnessing the social changes that followed the Revolution. Her education, unusual for a woman of her generation, included not only traditional feminine accomplishments, but also serious study of literature, philosophy, and music. Sand's family background connected her to both the aristocratic culture of the old regime and the democratic aspirations of the new. Her grandmother had been a friend of Madame de Pompadour and had participated in the salon culture of the 18th century. But Sand herself grew up in a world where merit mattered more than birth. Sand's decision to leave her husband and pursue an independent career as a writer represented a practical application of libertine principles to the circumstances of post-revolutionary society. Her adoption of male clothing, her relationship with younger men like Frédéric Chopin, and her insistence on supporting herself through her own work challenged every convention governing women's behavior in early 19th century France. But Sand's libertinage was more than simple rebellion against social convention. Her novels explored the psychological and moral complexity of relationships that transcended traditional categories. Works like Indiana and Lélia examined the inner lives of women who sought authentic connection in a society that offered them only predetermined roles as daughters, wives, and mothers. Sand's female characters were revolutionary because they insisted on being treated as complete human beings rather than as men's property or appendages. They demanded the right to think, feel, and choose for themselves. They refused to accept that their value was determined by their relationships to men. Sand spent long hours in her study at Nohant, writing by candlelight through the night while her household slept. Her work habits, which reversed normal patterns of activity and rest, reflected her rejection of conventional rhythms in favor of schedules that served her creative needs. The manuscripts that emerged from these nocturnal sessions revealed a mind that had absorbed libertine skepticism about traditional authorities while developing new forms of understanding suited to changed historical circumstances. Sand's writing process was intensely physical. She wrote with a speed that amazed her contemporaries, sometimes producing 20 pages in a single night. Her manuscripts show few corrections or revisions, suggesting that her ideas flowed directly from inspiration to expression without the mediation of rational reflection. Her relationship with Chopin, conducted partly in public and partly in private over the course of nearly a decade, became a kind of laboratory for exploring the possibilities and limitations of romantic love freed from conventional constraints. Their correspondence, preserved in letters that would not be published until the 20th century, reveals two artists attempting to create new forms of intimacy based on mutual respect for each other's creative work. The relationship between Sand and Chopin challenged every convention of their time. She was older, more famous, and more financially successful. He was younger, more fragile, and dependent on her support. Their roles reversed traditional expectations about masculine and feminine behavior in ways that scandalized contemporary observers. Their correspondence reveals the difficulties of maintaining authentic intimacy in a world that provided no models for the kind of relationship they were trying to create. They struggled with jealousy, misunderstanding, and the pressure of public scrutiny, while also discovering moments of connection that neither had experienced before. The salon that Sand maintained at Nohant during the 1840s and 1850s attracted writers, musicians, and political figures who shared her interest in combining aesthetic achievement with social reform. Visitors like Flaubert, Turgenev, and Delacroix found in her an environment where artistic experimentation could proceed alongside political discussion and personal exploration. These gatherings differed significantly from the aristocratic salons of the 18th century. Sand's guests included people from middle class and even working class backgrounds who had achieved distinction through their own talents rather than through inherited privilege. The conversations that took place at Nohant reflected democratic ideals that would have been impossible in pre-revolutionary libertine circles. Saint Salon was a laboratory for exploring how artistic creation might contribute to social progress. Her guests debated whether art should serve political purposes or pursue beauty for its own sake. They discussed the relationship between individual creativity and collective responsibility. These conversations influenced the development of literary and artistic movements throughout the 19th century. The idea that artists had special responsibilities to society, that creative work could contribute to human progress, that beauty and truth were interconnected, all emerged from the discussions at Nohant. Charles Baudelaire developed what might be called an aesthetic libertinage that combined sensual exploration with artistic creation. His Flowers of Evil, published in 1857, explored the relationship between beauty and corruption, pleasure and pain, desire and destruction, with an intensity that pushed libertine themes in entirely new directions. Baudelaire had absorbed the psychological sophistication of earlier libertine writers, while adding new elements derived from his study of contemporary urban life. His poetry captured the experience of modern city dwellers who found themselves surrounded by artificial pleasures and commercialized desires that bore little resemblance to the natural impulses celebrated by earlier libertine thinkers. The modern city created new forms of desire and new forms of alienation. Baudelaire's poetry explored how traditional libertine insights might apply to people living in environments that were entirely artificial, where nature had been replaced by architecture and authentic relationships had been replaced by commercial transactions. His exploration of hashish and opium, detailed in works like Artificial Paradises, represented an attempt to discover through chemical means the kinds of consciousness that earlier libertines had sought through philosophical reflection and social experimentation. His careful analysis of drug-induced states of mind revealed both their potential for aesthetic insight and their limitations as sources of authentic experience. Baudelaire understood that drugs offered shortcuts to altered consciousness that could inspire artistic creation. But he also recognized that these shortcuts were dangerous substitutes for the slower, more difficult work of psychological and spiritual development. The painter Eugène Delacroix, a close friend of Baudelaire and frequent visitor to George Sand's salon, translated libertine themes into visual form through paintings that celebrated exotic subjects and passionate emotions. His Women of Algiers and Death of Sardanapalus depicted scenes of sensual abandon that would have scandalized earlier generations, while also revealing the sophisticated understanding of color and composition that marked him as a serious artist. Delacroix's paintings demonstrated that libertine sensibility could be expressed through visual means as well as literary ones. His use of color to convey emotion, his dynamic compositions that seem to capture movement and passion, his ability to make classical and exotic subjects seem immediate and contemporary, all reflected libertine insights about the relationship between aesthetic experience and psychological understanding. Delacroix's journals, kept throughout his career and published posthumously, reveal an artist who combined libertine appreciation for beauty and pleasure with disciplined commitment to his craft. His analysis of his own creative process, his observations about the relationship between emotion and artistic technique, and his reflections on the social role of the artist all reflected libertine insights adapted to the circumstances of professional artistic life in the 19th century. The emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline provided libertine thought with new theoretical foundations and new vocabularies for expressing insights about human nature. The work of early psychologists like Franz Anton Mesmer and later Pierre Janet suggested that human behavior was governed by unconscious forces that could be studied and understood, but not easily controlled through moral exhortation or social pressure. These psychological theories provided scientific justification for libertine skepticism about traditional moral systems, while also suggesting that the exploration of human nature might require more sophisticated methods than previous generations had employed. The careful observation of behavior, the analysis of motivation, and the recognition of unconscious influences all became part of a more scientific approach to questions that libertines had previously addressed through philosophical speculation and personal experimentation. The development of psychology as a discipline was partly a response to the inadequacy of traditional moral and religious explanations for human behavior. As European societies became more complex and diverse, older systems of understanding proved insufficient for explaining why people acted as they did. Psychology offered new tools for understanding individual differences, psychological development, and the relationship between conscious and unconscious motivation. These tools could be applied to questions that libertine thinkers had been exploring for centuries, but with greater precision and systematic rigor. The 20th century brought unprecedented challenges to libertine tradition while also creating new opportunities for the exploration of human freedom and authenticity. The catastrophic wars that dominated the first half of the century demonstrated the limitations of rationalist optimism about human nature. While the social movements that emerged after 1945 extended libertine insights about individual autonomy to groups that had been excluded from earlier discussions of freedom. The scale of violence and destruction unleashed during the two world wars forced a fundamental reconsideration of Enlightenment assumptions about human progress and rational behavior. Libertine confidence in the power of education and sophistication to improve human conduct seemed naive in the face of systematic genocide and mechanized warfare. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theories, developed through decades of clinical observation and theoretical refinement, provided libertine thought with its most sophisticated framework for understanding human psychology. The discovery of the unconscious, the recognition of infantile sexuality, the analysis of repression and sublimation all vindicated libertine insights about the complexity of human motivation and the dangers of moral oversimplification. Freud had absorbed the libertine tradition through his reading of literature and philosophy, but he transformed these insights through scientific method and clinical experience. His case studies revealed the psychological costs of sexual repression, while also demonstrating the difficulty of achieving the kind of authentic self-knowledge that libertine philosophy had always claimed as its goal. The psychoanalytic method provided a systematic approach to the exploration of human psychology that earlier libertines had pursued through more intuitive means. Freud's techniques for uncovering unconscious motivation, for understanding the relationship between childhood experience and adult behavior, for analyzing the symbolic content of dreams and fantasies, all represented refined versions of methods that libertine thinkers had been developing for centuries. The psychoanalytic movement that developed around Freud's work created new institutional forms for the exploration of human psychology that combined libertine insights with professional clinical practice. The psychoanalytic session, with its emphasis on free association and the exploration of unconscious motivation, represented a democratization of techniques that had previously been available only to aristocratic participants in libertine salons. But psychoanalysis also revealed the limitations of traditional libertine approaches to human development. Freud's patients demonstrated that intellectual understanding of psychological dynamics was not sufficient to produce therapeutic change, that the exploration of unconscious desires could be as likely to produce anxiety and confusion as liberation and fulfillment. The therapeutic relationship provided a controlled environment for the kind of psychological exploration that libertines had pursued in salons and private relationships. But it also revealed how difficult it was to translate insight into behavioral change, how resistant people were to abandoning familiar patterns even when those patterns caused suffering. The sexual revolution of the 1960s seemed to vindicate many libertine insights about the artificial nature of sexual restrictions and the possibility of organizing society according to more rational and humane principles. The development of reliable contraception, the questioning of traditional gender roles, and the emergence of movements for sexual equality all reflected ideas that libertine thinkers had been exploring for centuries. Yet the practical results of sexual liberation often differed significantly from what libertine philosophers had anticipated. The commercialization of sexuality through mass media and consumer culture created new forms of exploitation and alienation that bore little resemblance to the refined pleasures that traditional libertinage had celebrated. The democratization of libertine ideas through popular culture often resulted in crude hedonism rather than the sophisticated exploration of human possibility that earlier libertines had pursued. The sexual revolution demonstrated both the power and the limitations of libertine ideas when applied to mass society. The removal of traditional constraints did create new opportunities for authentic self-expression and genuine human connection. But it also created new forms of manipulation and commodification that were in some ways more oppressive than the old restrictions. The feminist movement drew upon libertine arguments about individual autonomy and the right to self-determination while also criticizing libertinage's historical focus on male experience and masculine perspectives. Female writers and theorists like Simone de Beauvoir demonstrated that women's exclusion from libertine culture had not been accidental but systematic, reflecting broader patterns of gender inequality that libertine philosophy had failed to address adequately. De Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, provided a comprehensive analysis of women's situation that drew upon libertine insights while also revealing their limitations. Her exploration of women's psychology, her analysis of social constraints on female development, and her vision of authentic existence all reflected libertine themes adapted to feminist concerns. But de Beauvoir also demonstrated that achieving authentic existence required not just individual choice, but social transformation. The economic independence, educational opportunities, and legal rights that women needed to live freely could not be achieved through philosophical reflection or aesthetic cultivation alone, but required organized political action and institutional change. The feminist critique of traditional libertinage revealed how libertine emphasis on individual freedom had often ignored the social and economic structures that made such freedom possible. Male libertines had been able to pursue their philosophical and aesthetic interests partly because women's unpaid labor had freed them from domestic responsibilities. The civil rights movement in the United States and similar movements elsewhere extended libertine principles about human dignity and individual autonomy to racial and ethnic groups that had been excluded from earlier discussions of freedom. The recognition that social categories like race were human constructions rather than natural facts reflected libertine skepticism about traditional authorities and conventional wisdom. But these movements also revealed that achieving equality required more than philosophical insight or individual enlightenment. The legal, economic, and social barriers that prevented full participation in society had to be dismantled through collective action and political struggle, not just overcome through personal cultivation and aesthetic refinement. The civil rights movement demonstrated that libertine ideas about human equality and individual dignity had radical political implications that earlier libertines had not fully grasped. If all human beings possessed equal worth and dignity, then systems that denied this equality stood condemned regardless of their historical traditions or cultural legitimacy. The environmental movement raised new questions about the relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility that libertine philosophy had not adequately addressed. If human behavior affected global climate patterns and ecological systems, then traditional libertine assumptions about the sovereignty of individual choice needed to be reconsidered in light of scientific understanding about planetary boundaries and environmental limits. The environmental crisis revealed that the libertine emphasis on individual autonomy was inadequate for addressing problems that required collective action and global cooperation. The atmospheric and oceanic systems that supported human life did not respect national boundaries or individual preferences. Contemporary libertinage has become more democratic and diverse, but also more diffuse and less philosophically coherent than its historical predecessors. The Internet has created new possibilities for community formation and identity exploration, allowing people to connect with others who share unconventional interests and to experiment with forms of relationship and self-expression that would have been impossible in earlier periods. Online communities have emerged around virtually every conceivable variation of libertine practice, from philosophical discussion groups to lifestyle communities focused on specific forms of sexual or social experimentation. These digital networks lack the physical presence and cultural sophistication of traditional salons, but they offer accessibility and diversity that historical libertinage never achieved. The democratization of libertine ideas through digital technology has created opportunities for people from all social backgrounds to explore questions of identity, sexuality, and authentic living. But it has also led to the fragmentation of libertine culture into countless specialized subcultures that often have little connection to each other or to the broader philosophical tradition. Dating applications and social media platforms have created new forms of sexual and romantic exploration that seem to realize libertine dreams of freedom from traditional constraints. But these technological tools often reduce the psychological and philosophical complexity of human relationship to simple consumer choices, transforming libertine insights about authenticity and connection into marketing strategies for commercial platforms. The rise of artificial intelligence and virtual reality technologies promises even more radical transformations of human experience that will require new forms of libertine thinking. If people can have meaningful relationships with artificial beings, if they can experience completely fabricated realities, if they can modify their own psychology through technological means, then traditional assumptions about human nature and authentic existence may need to be completely reconsidered. These technological possibilities raise fundamental questions about the nature of human experience and the meaning of authentic living that will challenge libertine thinkers for generations to come. The eternal questions and continuing conversation. As our exploration of libertinage draws toward its conclusion, we find ourselves returning to the questions that first sparked this dangerous philosophy in the gardens of Renaissance Florence more than 5 centuries ago. What is the relationship between pleasure and virtue? How much freedom can human societies tolerate without losing their coherence? What are the costs and benefits of challenging traditional authorities? Can human beings create better ways of living through reason and experience, or are we bound by limitations that no amount of sophistication can overcome? Libertinage provided one set of answers to these eternal questions, but its legacy proves more complex than simple advocacy for freedom and pleasure. The movement's greatest contribution may have been its demonstration that human nature is more various and adaptable than traditional authorities assumed, that individual experience is a valid source of moral knowledge, and that the pursuit of happiness is a legitimate goal for both individuals and societies. The salon culture that nurtured libertinage for centuries created forms of intellectual and social life that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility, personal exploration with mutual respect, and aesthetic refinement with ethical seriousness. The conversations that took place in these protected environments demonstrated that controversial ideas could be explored without crude confrontation, that intellectual rigor could coexist with social grace, and that the pursuit of truth could be both serious and pleasurable. Yet libertinage also revealed the difficulties of extending these insights beyond small circles of educated elites to entire societies. The aristocratic assumptions that had shaped libertine culture since the Renaissance proved difficult to reconcile with democratic ideals of equality and popular participation. The focus on individual cultivation and aesthetic refinement could seem irrelevant or even decadent when confronted with urgent problems of economic inequality and social justice. The libertine emphasis on skepticism about traditional authorities provided valuable tools for challenging oppression and imagining alternatives, but it also could undermine the social bonds and shared values that communities need to function effectively. The same intellectual sophistication that enabled libertines to see through false claims and hypocritical behavior could also make it difficult to commit to any positive program for improvement or reform. Perhaps libertinage's most enduring legacy lies not in its specific prescriptions for human behavior, but in its method of inquiry. The libertine commitment to honest observation, rational analysis, and experimental verification provided tools for understanding human nature that remain valuable regardless of one's conclusions about how people should live. The movement's emphasis on civilized discourse and collaborative exploration created models for discussing difficult questions that democratic societies still need to learn. The libertine insight that human beings require not just freedom from constraint, but also positive resources for self-development has influenced fields ranging from psychology to education to urban planning. The recognition that individuals flourish in environments that support both personal growth and social connection has shaped everything from therapeutic practice to architectural design to organizational management. The movement's integration of intellectual rigor with aesthetic appreciation, its understanding that the pursuit of beauty and pleasure could be compatible with serious moral reflection, offers an alternative to the grim earnestness that often characterizes contemporary public discourse. The libertine demonstration that learning could be joyful, that serious inquiry could be socially engaging, that rigorous thinking need not require the suppression of human warmth and creativity remains relevant to anyone who seeks to combine personal fulfillment with intellectual honesty. In our own time, when traditional authorities continue to be challenged, when new forms of community and relationship are emerging, when questions about individual freedom and social responsibility have taken on global dimensions, the libertine tradition offers not easy answers, but sophisticated tools for thinking about enduring human dilemmas. The movement's greatest gift may be its demonstration that these questions are worth pursuing, that human beings are capable of both more freedom and more responsibility than we often assume, and that the conversation about how to live well is itself one of the most important activities in which conscious beings can engage. Evening settles gently over modern Paris as our exploration of Libertinage draws to its close. The lights of the city reflect off the same Seine that once carried the boats of courtiers traveling between chateaux where libertine ideas first flowered. The river continues its ancient course, bearing the reflections of contemporary bridges and buildings, just as it once carried the hopes and fears of those who dared to ask dangerous questions about human nature and social possibility. In the libraries and bookshops that still line the banks of the Seine, scholars and readers continue to discover libertine texts that challenge their age and continue to challenge ours. The works of Montaigne and La Rochefoucauld, of Laclos and George Sand, of Charles Baudelaire, rest on shelves beside contemporary books that grapple with the same fundamental questions about freedom, authenticity, desire, and human relationship that have preoccupied thinking people for centuries. The physical spaces where libertine culture flourished have largely vanished or been transformed beyond recognition. The chateaux of the Loire Valley are now tourist attractions where visitors can admire the architecture while remaining largely unaware of the intellectual revolutions that once took place in their chambers. The great Parisian salons have given way to museums and offices, their intimate conversations replaced by guided tours and business meetings. Yet something essential persists across these transformations. The libertine insight that human beings are capable of more than traditional authorities allowed, that individual experience is a valid source of knowledge, that the pursuit of happiness is a legitimate goal for both individuals and societies. These ideas continue to shape how we think about ourselves and our relationships with others, in ways both obvious and subtle. The conversation that began in Renaissance Italy continues in forms that its original participants could never have imagined. University seminars explore libertine philosophy alongside feminist theory, critical race studies, and post-colonial criticism. Online forums debate the same questions about individual autonomy and social responsibility that once animated salon discussions. Dating applications promise to liberate users from traditional constraints, while often reducing complex human desires to algorithmic matches and market transactions. Contemporary feminism has both built upon and transformed libertine traditions, recognizing their insights about individual autonomy while also pointing out their frequent blindness to issues of power and privilege. The LGBTQ+ rights movement has extended libertine principles to groups that historical libertines often ignored or marginalized, while also developing new understandings of identity and relationship that go beyond traditional libertine categories. The environmental crisis has raised questions about the sustainability of libertine individualism that earlier generations could not have anticipated. If human choices have collective consequences that transcend national boundaries and generational timelines, if individual behavior affects global climate patterns and ecological systems, then the libertine emphasis on personal freedom may need to be balanced with new forms of responsibility and restraint that libertine philosophy did not adequately develop. Yet the libertine method of inquiry, honest observation, rational analysis, willingness to question received wisdom, commitment to civilized discourse remains as valuable as ever for addressing these contemporary challenges. The libertine tradition of creating spaces where controversial ideas can be explored safely, where people from different backgrounds can engage as intellectual equals, where serious questions can be pursued with both rigor and grace, provides models for democratic deliberation that our polarized societies desperately need. The salon tradition, with its emphasis on conversation as an art form, its integration of pleasure and learning, its creation of communities based on shared intellectual interests rather than inherited privilege, offers inspiration for new forms of public engagement that might bridge the gaps between expert knowledge and citizen understanding, between academic research and practical wisdom, between individual insight and collective action. Modern libertinage takes forms that would both fascinate and trouble its historical predecessors. The sexual revolution realized many libertine dreams while also revealing unexpected complications and unintended consequences. The democratization of libertine ideas through mass media and digital technology has created new possibilities while also leading to commercialization and superficiality that earlier libertines would have found distressing. The emergence of artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and genetic engineering technologies promises transformations of human experience that will require entirely new forms of libertine thinking. If people can have relationships with artificial beings, experience fabricated realities, or modify their own biology, then traditional assumptions about human nature and authentic existence may need fundamental reconsideration. Perhaps most importantly, the libertine demonstration that the pursuit of pleasure and the pursuit of truth are not incompatible, that learning can be joyful, that serious inquiry can be socially engaging, that intellectual rigor need not require the suppression of human warmth and creativity, offers an antidote to the grim earnestness that often characterizes contemporary discourse about serious subjects. The libertine legacy reminds us that human beings are capable of both more freedom and more responsibility than we often assume, that the cultivation of individual potential and the creation of just communities are not opposing goals, but complementary aspects of human flourishing, and that the conversation about how to live well is itself one of the most distinctively human activities, one of the things that makes consciousness worthwhile. As the lights of Paris begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk, reflecting off the same river that has witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, we might remember that libertinage, at its best, was never simply about the pursuit of individual pleasure, but about the larger human project of understanding what it means to flourish as conscious beings in relationship with others. The questions that drove libertine inquiry remain our questions. How do we honor both individual dignity and collective responsibility? How do we create societies that nurture human potential while maintaining the bonds of community? How do we pursue happiness without losing sight of justice? How do we remain true to ourselves while also remaining open to growth and change? These questions have no final answers, but they offer something more valuable. The ongoing conversation in which we discover not just what we think, but who we are and who we might become. The libertines of Renaissance. Italy and Enlightenment France gave us not solutions, but tools, not dogmas, but methods, not final truths, but better ways of seeking truth. Their greatest gift was the demonstration that this seeking itself, honest, rigorous, passionate, civilized, collaborative, is one of the most distinctively human activities, one of the things that makes the gift of consciousness worthwhile. In libraries and cafes, in classrooms and online forums, in the privacy of individual reflection and the intimacy of close relationships, their conversation continues. The libertine tradition teaches us that we are neither angels nor beasts, but something more interesting and more complex. Beings capable of reason and passion, individuals embedded in communities, creatures who can question our nature while remaining true to it, who can dream of perfection while accepting our limitations, who can seek truth while understanding that the search itself may be the most important truth we discover. In the end, perhaps that is libertinage's most profound legacy. Not any particular vision of human flourishing, but the faith that human beings are capable of the conversation about flourishing, that we can examine our lives without destroying them, that we can question our traditions while honoring what is valuable in them, and that the pursuit of understanding about ourselves, our relationships, our societies, our possibilities, is itself a form of worship, a way of honoring the gift of consciousness in a universe that gives us both the freedom to choose and the responsibility to choose wisely. The conversation continues, as it must, in each generation that rediscovers both the power and the responsibility of human freedom, that learns again that the question of how to live is not one we can ever finally answer, but one we can never stop asking if we want to remain fully human. In asking it seriously, honestly, and together, we join the great conversation that began in Renaissance gardens and continues wherever people gather to explore, with courage and hope and intellectual honesty, what it might mean for human beings to flourish in all the complexity and beauty and difficulty of our shared existence on this small planet in a vast and mysterious cosmos. Sleep now and dream of candlelit chambers where ideas were born, of gardens where questions bloomed like flowers, of salons where minds met in the gentle pursuit of understanding. Let your thoughts drift with the story of those who dared to ask, what if we could live more freely, love more deeply, and think without chains? Rest and know that somewhere, in quiet corners of the world, the conversation continues.